Jesus, wir danken dir von ganzem Herzen, dass du hier bist, dass du wirkst, dass du ein Gott bist, der für uns ist. Und danke, vielen herzlichen Dank für diese Atmosphäre hier. Wir merken, du bist hier und es soll zu deiner Ehre sein. Dankeschön, dass du uns einfach diese Sicherheit auch gibst, in diese Themen einzutauchen. Und danke, segnest du Nancy mit allem, was sie braucht. Du gibst ihr die Erfrischung. Dankeschön, dass du da bist, Jesus. Und wir wollen dich sehen. Yes. Wir hören nicht hin, wir beten weiter, Herr, dass sie das alles noch erledigen kann. Super. Amen, Amen. Ihr dürft euch setzen. Ich möchte auch noch hinweisen, nach dieser Session werden wir nochmals kurz nach vorne kommen und einige Fragen beantworten. Sie dürfen wirklich das Thema betreffen. Ihr dürft die Fragen stellen, die euch betreffen. Vielleicht, wenn es ganz persönliche Fragen sind, könnte es sein, dass wir nicht gerade auf diese eingehen, weil wir wollen eben das, was sie gesagt hat, bei uns bleibt. Aber ihr dürft auch nachher noch auf Nancy zugehen und sie direkt fragen. Aber alles, was um das Thema geht, stellt uns die Fragen. Hier findet ihr den QR-Code. Und dann, genau, übergebe ich jetzt das Wort Nancy. Herzlichen Dank.
Okay, so tonight we get to talk about the issues in my book, Love Thy Body. And there I equip Christians to address the really hot button issues of our day, like abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, euthanasia, and so on. And typically we respond to each of these issues separately. But we will master the arguments much better if we realize that there's an underlying worldview that connects them all. And we were talking about this, you were talking about this earlier today, that for many people, it can be so helpful to discover that, hey, I have students who literally take out their little handbooks and memorize individual arguments on abortion. And he's typing in on Twitter, arguing with his friends. And individual arguments are great, but I would like you to get the big picture tonight. And as you've seen earlier, the concept of truth has been divided, and that affects everything. So today we are actually seeing a split between the body and the mind. And it is actually an expression of the fact-value split, just applied to the individual person. And so the lower story, remember the lower story is science, what we know by science. And so that's the fact realm. And then the upper story is about personhood, which is about your moral status. And so that's the value realm. And so what we're going to see is how much these two realms have been split apart and how the body, the biological side, has been devalued. Now, since the book came out, I've had more than 100, 200 media interviews. I almost dream in interview format. And so I thought today I would give you a chance to ask me questions. Not literally, of course, but what I've done is I've put together the most common questions that I get on radio shows, podcasts, and so on. So, are you ready? Here's your first question. So you teach apologetics, which means defending Christianity. The problem is the questions have changed. People are no longer asking, is Christianity true? They're asking, why are Christians such bigots? So how do you answer that? Well, the way I answer that is I turn the tables. I show that it's actually the secular or the atheist view that is harmful and negative. And why? Because it has a negative view of the dignity of the body. This is easiest to see if we jump right in with an example. So take abortion. A few years ago, an article appeared by a British broadcaster who said she had always been proudly pro-choice until she became pregnant with her own baby. And then she began to struggle. She writes, I was calling the life inside me, not quite yet. There's a next slide. I was calling the life inside me a baby because I wanted it. But if I hadn't wanted it, I would think of it as just a group of cells that it was okay to kill. To her credit, she realized that didn't make sense. Right? A fetus doesn't become a baby just because somebody wants it. And so she began to research the subject. Being a broadcaster, she did a documentary on the subject. And finally, she reached this conclusion. She said, well, in terms of science, I do have to agree that life begins at conception. But in terms of moral status, she says perhaps the fact of life is not what's important. It's whether that life is grown enough to start becoming a person. So do you see how the concept of the human being has been split apart? If you can be human life at one point but not a person until sometime later, then clearly these are two different things. So this is a radically divided, fragmented, dualistic view of what it means to be a human being, and we can use our metaphor of two stories in a building. So in the lowest story, most professional bioethicists today agree that life begins at conception. Not everyone realizes that. The typical uneducated person that you might talk to in the street might not know this, but professional bioethicists all agree that life begins at conception. The fetus is biologically, genetically, physiologically human. The evidence from science, from genetics and DNA, is just too strong to deny it. But how do they get around that fact? If they want to support abortion, what do? Well, they argue that merely being human is not enough to qualify for legal protection. The fetus has to earn the right to life by becoming a person, typically defined in terms of mental abilities, right? A certain level of self-awareness, cognitive functioning, and so on. So notice that what secular bioethicists are really saying is that even though the fetus is biologically human, that is not enough for human rights. The fetus can be killed for any reason or no reason. It can be used for research and experiments. It can be tinkered with genetically. It can be picked through for sellable body parts, as Planned Parenthood does, and then tossed out with the other medical waste. And that's exactly how the medical journals refer to the fetus after an abortion, as medical waste. In other words, being human is no longer enough for human rights. And there's a label for this view. It is called personhood theory. And what's the most obvious problem with it? Probably you've all figured it out already, and that is that no one can agree on how to define personhood. Right? Once you separate it from being biologically human, when does the fetus become a person? And how developed do its abilities have to be? And some people, probably most ordinary people, will say, well, yeah, it becomes a person sometime before birth. But there are people who are arguing today that it does not become a person until after birth. The two scientists who discovered the double helix structure of DNA, Crick and Watson, have both publicly argued that we should let a baby live for about 3 days so that it can be genetically tested for any kind of defects. And then, if it passes the tests, then it qualifies as human. The idea being that some birth defects don't show up until after birth, and parents should have the right to kill the baby, even after birth. Peter Singer is an ethics professor at Princeton University. He says, even 3 years of age is a gray area. So what's the lesson here? The lesson is the concept of personhood. Once you separate it from biology, it becomes arbitrary, it becomes subjective. There's no universal or objective criteria anymore. And in fact, every bioethicist does end up drawing the line at a different place, depending on their own private views and values. So what's happened is that the supporters of abortion have lost the argument on the scientific level. They've lost it. And therefore, they have shifted to the non-scientific, non-empirical, subjective concept of personhood. So it's time to turn the tables. When personhood is rooted in biology, then we have a marker that's objective, that's empirically testable, something we can identify scientifically. So today, it's Christians who are pro-science, who value human life at all levels, including the biological level. So I need to stop and let you ask another question. And here it is. In your book, you say that the same worldview is also driving the issue of euthanasia. Explain how that works. Well, you probably can figure that out already, right? That the driving force is personhood theory. It's just in reverse. According to personhood theory, if you're mentally disabled, if you no longer have a certain level of cortical functioning, then you are no longer a person, even though you're obviously still human. And at that point, many bioethicists say, you're not a person anymore, you're only a body. I've seen that language used. You're only a body. And then at that point, you can be unplugged, your treatment can be withheld, your food and water discontinued, and your organs harvested. So once again, being human is not enough for human rights. Several years ago, there was a euthanasia case in the US that got a lot of news coverage. Some of you may remember it. It was Terry Schiavo. Does that name ring a bell to some of you? So she was a young woman who'd suffered a cardiac arrest and had extensive brain damage. And the media presented it as a right to die case. Her name was, but Terry was not dying. Her parents were happy to take care of her. It was her husband who wanted her food and water discontinued so that she would die because he'd found a new woman. But so it went to court. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the courts ruled that she did not have a right to life. And her food and water were discontinued, and she was left to die of dehydration, which, as you probably know, is very painful. The worldview driving the debate was highlighted in a television interview where a bioethicist was asked, do you think Terry is a person? And he said, no, I do not. I think having awareness is an essential criterion for personhood. So personhood theory says it's not enough to be just part of the human race. You have to meet an additional set of criteria. You have to achieve a certain level of awareness or cognitive ability. You have to earn the status of personhood. And anyone who falls short is considered a non-person. So there's a new category now. Do you see the title? The human non-person. I was once invited to speak at an NPR program in San Francisco. And I thought this could be a challenging audience. But the producer ran a pre-interview where he asked my opinion on certain views, including abortion. And he said, most people consider abortion acceptable until the fetus becomes a person. And I said, that statement carries a lot of philosophical baggage. I said, the secular view is fragmented. It assumes that the body is disconnected from the person and has no value on its own. Right? That as long as the fetus can be said to be only a body, it has no value. The pro-life view is holistic. It says the body shares in the inherent dignity of the whole person. The secular view is exclusive. It says some people don't measure up. They don't make the cut. They don't qualify for the status of personhood. The pro-life view is inclusive. It says, as long as you're a member of the human race, you're in. You count. You have the dignity of a full member of the moral community. That's a phrase that ethicists use when they say, who do we have a moral obligation to? Members of the moral community. A few days later, I got a call from the producer. He said they had decided to cancel the show. That's why you never hear from people like us. They cancel us. Okay, so let's move to the next question. It goes like this. The most surprising thing about your book is you claim that there's a worldview thread that connects things like abortion and euthanasia to questions of sexuality. That's kind of surprising. Explain that. Well, again, it's the division of the body from the person. Take hookup culture. The whole premise is that sex can be purely physical, cut off from the whole person. In Love Thy Body, I include several poignant quotes from college students, like Alicia, who says, hookups are very scripted. You learn to turn everything off except your body. You make yourself emotionally invulnerable. A college student interviewed in the Rolling Stone magazine put it this way: the mistake people make is they assume that there are two very distinct elements in a relationship, one emotional and one sexual, and they pretend like there are clean lines between them. Do you see how she's almost verbally describing this? Our two-story diagram. Now, Christians will sometimes say that the hookup culture gives sex too much importance, but in reality, it gives sex too little importance. In another Rolling Stone article, a young man was interviewed, and he said, sex is just a piece of body touching another piece of body. It is existentially meaningless. That's too little importance. And a former lesbian, who's now Catholic, by the way, puts it this way: beneath all the pageantry of free sex and self-love, there is a fundamental despair, a belief that the body doesn't mean anything, that it is insignificant in a literal sense, signifying nothing. So no wonder the hookup culture is leaving a trail of wounded people. People are trying to live out a secularist ethic that does not fit who they truly are. A college psychologist said, the two most prescribed medications on the college campus today are birth control pills and antidepressants. And she said that is not a coincidence. The Christian ethic is incarnational. The most complete and intimate physical union is meant to express the most complete and intimate union of the whole person in the whole life commitment of marriage. And science is on our side. Again, science has shown the interconnection of body and person with the discovery of hormones like oxytocin and vasopressin. These are called the bonding hormones because they create a sense of attachment and trust. As a UCLA psychiatrist put it this way, she said, you might say we were designed to bond. Kind of an unusual phrase for a UCLA psychiatrist. Scripture teaches that human beings are embodied spirits. Embodied spirits. And both are part of our identity. This comes out beautifully in the parallelism of Hebrew poetry. My soul thirsts for you, my flesh yearns for you. Our soul has sunk down into the dust, our body cleaves to the earth. Keep my words in the midst of your heart, for they are life to those who find them and health to all their body. So, according to Scripture, the inner life of the soul is expressed through the outer life of the body. So the Bible treats the human being as an integrated unity. I'd better stop and let you ask another question. Not surprisingly, the next question gets into more controversial territory. What about homosexuality? Once again, the secular ethic divides the body from the person and devalues the body. Think of it this way. Even my homosexual friends agree that on the level of biology, physiology, anatomy, and chromosomes, males and females are counterparts to one another. That is how the human sexual and reproductive system is designed. To embrace a same-sex identity, then, is implicitly to contradict that design. Is to say, why should my body inform my identity? Why should my biological sex, as male or female, have any say in my moral choices? We have to help people to see. Wait, did I skip one? We have to help people to see that this is a profoundly disrespectful view of the body. It pits the mind against the body and says it's only the mind and feelings that count. And so we can use our two-story diagram again. And since I did tell you a little about my own story, that is exactly the reason I went through. When I was having issues with same-sex attraction, I even got married. And so one day I was talking to my husband about it, and he said, think of it this way. Because God made you a woman, no matter what your feelings are right now, you will be ultimately more fulfilled with a man. Amen. And he said, of course it goes both ways, right? He says, I'm a man, and I can be confident that I will ultimately be more fulfilled with with a woman. Gosh. And that made sense. It was logical. And it made sense to my mind. Yes, of course. My moral choices, my identity should be shaped by the body God gave me. And it took about 4 more years. It didn't happen overnight, but that was the turning point. That conversation was the turning point, and that is what led to this book. Now, some people will argue that if sexual orientation is rooted in our genes, well, then they are being true to their biology. But there's no conclusive evidence of any biological cause. This is the APA, the American Psychological Association, puts this right on its website. No findings have emerged that permit scientists to conclude that sexual orientation is determined by any particular factor, and they've looked at both genetic and social. In fact, the surprising thing is that more recent research has found out that about 80% of people who come out as homosexual change their sexual identity label at least once. At least once, which means for some it's more often than once. That does not sound like a trait that is biologically determined. By the way, this is the findings of Lisa Diamond, who herself is lesbian. And she said, the problem is that people just didn't ask people, they didn't ask a male homosexual, when were you last attracted to a woman? But when they asked him, they'd say, well, last month. Their sexual fluidity for both men and women was much higher than anyone realized. And it's Lisa Diamond who discovered this. In religious circles, it is sometimes said that God made people gay, right? You've heard that, right? God made me gay. But I met a former homosexual who's now married to a woman, you have to say that these days, and has 3 children. And here's how he put it. He said, if God made some people gay, wouldn't that make him a cruel God? Because it would mean he has engineered their minds and emotions for attraction to the same sex, and yet he's created their physiology to be in direct opposition to that attraction. Would God create people to be torn in 2 conflicting directions like that? Not the Christian view of God. Things like conflict, self-division, self-alienation are results of the fall, not creation. Yet today it's widely accepted that if someone experiences that conflict between body and mind, it's only the mind that counts, your desires. And what should we say as Christians? We should say, why accept such a demeaning view of the body? The Christian ethic is holistic. It says our mind and emotions are meant to be in tune with our body. And as a result, it's an ethic that overcomes self-alienation. It leads to a sense of internal unity and wholeness. In a real interview, I sometimes have to stop and let the radio host ask another question. So often they will say, the most surprising thing about your book is that claim that the secular worldview demeans or denigrates the body. That is not what we normally hear. And that's true, right? If a person does not believe in God and thinks the physical universe is all that exists, you would expect him to think the physical universe was really important. But surprisingly, it's the opposite. And the reason is that the secular ethic derives from the theory that nature is a product of blind, purposeless forces, and therefore the human body has no intrinsic purpose that we are morally obligated to respect. And I will quote here from a woman who makes exactly that argument. She's an outspoken lesbian named Camille Paglia. And some Christians know her, right? I knew you would, Paul. Christians sometimes read her because she's a bit of an iconoclastic feminist. She does not believe sex is a social construction. She says, no, nature made us male and female. In fact, she says, our sexual bodies are designed for reproduction. Designed, a strange word for an atheist. But if nature designed us as male and female, how does she defend being lesbian? She says, well, why not defy nature? After all, fate, not God, has given us this flesh. We have absolute claim to our bodies and may do with them as we see fit. So do you see the logic there? If our bodies are products of mindless, purposeless forces, then they have no intrinsic purpose. They convey no moral message. They give no clue to our identity. We may do with them as we see fit. What does the Bible say? It teaches that nature was designed for a purpose. And science is on our side again. It's evident to observation that living things are structured for a purpose. That eyes are for seeing, ears are for hearing, wings are for flying, fins are for swimming. In fact, the development of the entire organism is directed by an inbuilt genetic plan or blueprint, DNA. So science itself tells us that nature exhibits a design, a plan, an order, a purpose. And as Christians, we should stand out from the secular world by having a high view of the value and worth of God's creation. In Love Thy Body, I tell lots of personal stories. Don't think of it as just a book of arguments. And one of my favorites is a young man named Sean. And when he was growing up, he identified exclusively as gay and attracted to other men. Today, he is married to a woman and has 3 children. But what's interesting about his story is that he grew up in a gay-affirming family and attended a gay-affirming church. So he didn't think there was anything wrong with homosexuality. And you say, wait a minute, why did he change then? You know, a gay activist will often say if somebody does change, they were driven by guilt and shame and self-loathing. But since he didn't think there was anything wrong with that, he was not driven by guilt. Here's what he says. I came to realize that as a man, God's original intention for me in creation was to be able to relate sexually to a woman. And this remained true quite irrespective of whatever feelings I might have. He says, I did not try to change my feelings directly, which rarely works. He said, my goal instead was to acknowledge what I already had, which was a male body, as a good gift from God. And eventually, my feelings started to follow suit. So you see, he did not defy nature, as Camille Paglia puts it. He accepted the body as fundamentally good, a good gift from God. And that's really the question at the core of this debate. Do we live in a cosmos operating by blind material forces, or a cosmos designed by a loving creator, which is therefore intrinsically good? Not surprisingly, the next question usually is about the other cutting-edge issue of our day, which is transgenderism. What is the worldview driving the trans movement? It's the same worldview. It's the same devaluing of the body. Transgender activists argue explicitly that your gender identity has nothing to do with your physical body, with your biological sex. A BBC documentary says at the heart of the debate is the idea that your mind can be at war with your body. And in that war, it's the mind that wins. Another BBC video features a young woman who identifies as non-binary, telling teenagers, it doesn't matter what living meat skeleton you've been born in, it's what you feel that defines you. So your body has been reduced to a meat skeleton. Jessica Savano is a male-to-female transsexual who created a Kickstarter page for a documentary titled, I Am Not My Body. That title kind of says it all, right? My body is not part of my authentic self. Schools have become the main delivery system today for gender ideology. The Washington Post quoted a curriculum where first-grade teachers were instructed to tell children, you might feel like you're a boy even if you have body parts that some people might tell you are girl parts. Notice what some people might tell you. They won't even call them girl parts. Or, of course, the opposite. You might feel like you're a girl even if you have body parts that some people might tell you are boy parts. Now, I have been asked to delve more deeply into transgenderism tomorrow, right? Tomorrow morning. So I'm not going to go a whole lot deeper right now. But we can use our metaphor of two stories in a building again, right? Because biology is in the lower story. That's based on science. That's what we know empirically. Gender identity has been separated off into the upper story, where they have no connection anymore. So what should our response be? As Christians, we should ask, why should anyone accept such an extreme devaluation of the body? I read an interview with a 14-year-old girl who had lived as a trans boy for 3 years, from age 11, and then had detransitioned to reclaim her identity as a girl. And listen to her own words. She said, "The turning point came when I realized it's not conversion therapy to learn to love your body." And this came out after my book was already out, but it would have been a great quote for a book titled Love Your Body. And even secular people are starting to say that the transgender movement expresses body hatred. Do you see that at the top? They're starting to recognize that it's a denigration of the body. And what that means is Christians have a wonderful opportunity to show that a biblical ethic expresses a positive view of the way God made us as physically embodied beings. Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. So our sexual nature is part of the created order that is declaring the glory of God. Here's your next question. I cannot ever talk about these issues without somebody saying, what about intersex people? So I finally figured I have to put it in my talk, not wait to the Q&A, because it's going to come up. What are intersex people? Many people think intersex is the same as transgender. It is not the same. So transgender people have completely normal physical traits, right? Their genes, their gonads, their genitals all align with one another. Intersex people do have a genuine physical condition. Their reproductive anatomy is atypical or anomalous due to a malfunction in their genes or their hormones. Now, transgender activists will often try to confuse the public because they use the existence of intersex people to argue that there's not just male and female, right? That there's a spectrum in between. But that's not true. There's still only two gametes, sperm and egg. There's no spectrum in between. And even intersex people are either male with some anomalies or female with some anomalies. Rarely, okay, just yesterday, there's a biologist who posted something on Twitter. So he posted an image where he had, 49% of people are male, 52 or so percent of people are female, and then he had this tiny little box, 0.02% are intersex, 0.02%. So obviously, mathematically, they cannot be a spectrum in between male and female. Even if you tried to make that case, mathematically, it does not work. Now, while I was writing Love Thy Body, an intersex woman contacted me. I don't know how she knew I was writing this book, but she wanted to make sure I got her side of the story. And here's what she said. She was very upset that transgender activists use intersex people for their own purposes. And here's how she put it. How do you think it feels being a pawn in someone else's game? It hurts to be shoved into the LGBT camp by either side. Because Christians don't always recognize what intersex is either. And she's had Christians push her into the, oh, you're trans, right? No, it's not the same thing. And so there you get it straight from the mouth of somebody who herself is intersex. Let's talk about practical strategies. What do we do if somebody in our family, our friend group, our church, our school identifies as gay or trans? In Love Thy Body, I tell the story of a young woman named Jean who lived as a lesbian for several years. Today, she is married to a man and has 2 children. And what was the turning point? Jean says, I finally came to trust that God had made me female for a reason, and I wanted to honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design. Isn't that beautiful? Usually the audience goes, oh. Because we're so used to Christians having a negative approach to these issues, right? It's a sin, it's wrong, it's against the Bible, don't do it, and there's something wrong with you. You know, Christians have a reputation for this, having a very negative message. And look at how she puts it. I wanted to honor my body by living in accordance with the Creator's design. So my strategy number 1 is use positive language. Honor your body. Respect your biological identity. Live in tune with your body. Live in harmony with the Creator's design. So when we talk to people, that should be our first message. Yes, we can talk about sin afterwards, but our leading message should be positive, and that's how we will win people's hearts. That we can have a message that their body is God's creation, and the biblical ethic shows us how to honor and respect it. Strategy number 2, be proactive. Studies have found that by far the strongest correlate of both same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria, far stronger than any genetic link, is childhood gender nonconformity, which simply means kids who behave in ways that are more stereotypical of the other sex. And here's one quote from the academic literature. One study found that childhood gender nonconforming behavior is a consistent early predictor of future non-heterosexual orientations. So in Love Thy Body, I tell the story of Brandon, who I mentioned a moment ago. So Brandon's not his real name. And he suffered from gender dysphoria from a very young age. Before he was even walking, his babysitter told his mom, he's too good to be a boy, by which she meant he's gentle and quiet and compliant and things that we normally associate with little girls. By elementary school, he was coming repeatedly, weeping and saying, weeping because he didn't fit in anywhere, right? He didn't fit in with the boys because he was such an outlier in terms of his personality, being gentle, sweet, compliant. But the girls didn't really accept him either because he's a boy. They didn't really accept him with sort of heart-to-heart friendships, and so he didn't feel like he fit in anywhere. By his early teens, he was scouring the internet for information on sex reassignment surgery. So what did his parents do? First of all, they made sure he knew they loved him just the way he was. They did not try to change him. A friend of mine is a former homosexual, and he said when he was young, he liked music and poetry. And he said, my father kept trying to toughen me up by pushing me into sports and other more traditional boy activities. Brandon's parents did not pressure him to be different. It's perfectly acceptable to be a gentle, sensitive, emotional boy. It does not mean you're really a girl. It's not you that's wrong, it's the stereotypes that are wrong. And of course, in the same way, it's perfectly acceptable for a girl to be gender nonconforming, to be assertive or interested in STEM subjects and so on. In Romans 12, the gifts of the Spirit are not divided by sex. Prophecy and teaching are not masculine, as we might expect. Mercy and service are not feminine. Eventually, Brandon came to accept that it is scientifically impossible to change your sex. There's a popular TED Talk by a cardiologist who says, every cell has a sex. Men and women are different down to the cellular and molecular level, and obviously you cannot change every cell in your body. Why are Christians not as effective as they could be on all of these issues? Well, it's because we have a divided way of thinking as well, right? We call it the sacred-secular split. It's our version of the fact-value split. As one of my students put it, growing up in the church, I was always taught, spirit good, body bad. So the next strategy is to recover our own heritage. The early Christian church was born into an ancient Greek and Roman culture that devalued the material world, just like modern secularism does, though for very different reasons. The early church was facing philosophies like Platonism and Gnosticism and Manichaeism. Augustine was a Manichae. And all of these isms treated this world as the realm of death, decay, and destruction. Gnosticism even taught that the material world was created by a low level. There were several deities, right? Several levels, and that this world was created by the lowest level, who is actually an evil god. Because this world is evil, so it must have been created by an evil god. Gnosticism denigrated the body as the prison of the soul, and therefore salvation was defined as escape from that prison, from the physical world. In this context, Christianity was nothing short of revolutionary. It taught that the material world was created not by some low-level deity, but by the supreme deity, who was a good God, and therefore it is intrinsically good. Yes, the world is fallen, but the fall is like a beautiful artistic masterpiece when a child takes a magic marker and scribbles on it. Yes, it's defaced, but the original beauty still shines through. And we still see the original beauty of God's creation. In the early church, however, Christianity's greatest scandal was its claim that the same supreme deity had actually entered into the realm of matter and taken on a physical body. So the incarnation is the ultimate affirmation of the dignity of the human body. What's more, when Jesus was executed on a Roman cross, we might say he did escape the prison of the soul, the body, as Gnosticism taught we should aspire to do. But what did he do then? He came back in a physical body, a bodily resurrection. To the Greeks, this was not spiritual progress. They literally did argue, who would want to come back to the realm of the body? The whole idea of a bodily resurrection was foolishness to the Greeks, as Paul puts it. And what's going to happen at the end of time? God is not going to scrap this physical world as if he made a mistake the first time around. He's going to restore it and renew it, creating a new heavens and a new earth and new bodies. So from the beginning, the Apostles' Creed has affirmed the resurrection of the body. This is an astonishingly high view of the physical world. There is nothing like it in any other religion or philosophy. You will never read these verses the same again. Honor God with your bodies, offer your bodies as the living sacrifice. As Christians, I don't think we often realize how exciting this should be. We should be absolutely excited about talking to non-Christians because what we have is so beautiful. It's so wonderful. It has such a high view of human dignity, of all of our self, body and soul, and the physical universe. We should be communicating that message with so much excitement and happiness and joy because there is no other worldview that gives people this kind of dignity and this kind of value. Let me end with a story. There's a woman named Laura Perry, and she transitioned to a male identity and successfully passed as a man for 10 years. And then she converted to Christianity. And at first, she thought she could continue living as a man. She said, I aspired to be a real man of God. But one day while she was praying, she seemed to hear God say to her, you cannot claim to love me and yet reject my creation. And she knew what that meant. It meant, you cannot reject the body that God has made for you. And of course, now she is living as the woman that God created her to be. So what's the answer to the secular worldview on issues of sexuality? To build a Christian culture that loves God and loves his creation. See, the good news is not only salvation. The good news is also creation. that God created you, body and soul and body, and that he calls you to love your body. Thank you very much.
Seid ihr ready? Seid ihr ready für ein paar Fragen? Wir steigen nochmal ein. Ich freue mich immer mega auf diese Frage- und Antwortzeiten. Da kommt nochmal so viel Power von Nancy her.
Whatever that was.
First question, Nancy. Are we ready? Yes. Why should a non-Christian person realize that body and soul are not separate?
Yeah, the reason that a non-Christian should care about these issues, especially the division of the body and the soul, or as they would say, the body and the person, right, personhood theory, is that they're human. I think sometimes as Christians we get so caught up in saying, well, this is a Christian view, this is a Christian view. No, it's the human view. It is good for humans to have internal unity. It's good for humans to have a sense of internal, self-integration. Psychologists talk about integration, being an integrated person, an integrated personality. It's just human to want to have your mind, your body, your soul, your feelings, your physical self all lined up, all aligned with one another. So this isn't a Christian thing, per se. Christianity tells us how we can be united, as opposed to the secular view which divides us. But it's a human longing to have a sense of, internal alignment. You guys know, some of you know Judith Butler. Judith Butler is considered the founder of queer theory. And in her book, it's fascinating. Well, she's a lesbian, and in her book, she says, well, of course, we really all want to be lined up in terms of our feelings, our sexual identity, our sexual orientation, our body. We want to be all lined up and all coordinated. And she said, but she's a lesbian, so she's not aligned. Her sexual orientation or her sexual feelings are not aligned with being a woman, because being a woman means being attracted to a man, and she's not. And so she basically just says, sorry, guys, you may wish that you could be all aligned, but, it's not possible. Because she's not aligned, she basically says, it's not possible. And I thought it was stunning that she first acknowledged that is our deepest longing, is to have that sort of internal coherence between all of our different parts. We want that kind of unity. But then she was willing to totally throw it out the window because she doesn't fit it. And so she wants, nobody else is allowed now to have that goal. No one else is allowed to have that ideal because she doesn't fit it. So all that to say, it is a human longing.
Very helpful, yeah. So person is, or a question is, how do I react to a person who asks to be addressed with pronouns other than their biological gender?
Yeah, I think that's one of the hardest ones. Don't you? And so I like to answer with an example. I had a graduate student who had a job at a very liberal church, and one of the persons who worked with him was a woman who decided she was going to transition. But they had worked together for many years, and they were very, very close friends. And so he basically said to her, I'm sorry, I can't say something to you that I think is false. I can't refer to you as a man. She was transitioning. She was changing her appearance and her name and her pronouns. And he said, it would violate my inner sense of integrity to say something I think is false. And they were good enough friends that she was willing to allow him. He was the only person. She was the only person who was allowed to call her she and use her real name. But she made an exception for him because of their relationship. And I thought, well, that's the ideal. The ideal is that we have such a good relationship with someone that they will allow us, to have integrity with our own view, just as they want, integrity with their view. the goal is to have relationship, right? So that you can do that. And Solzhenitsyn, and we do have to take it very seriously that when if you are coerced, if there's rules, if there's laws, now this is how Jordan Peterson became so famous, right? Because Canada passed a law saying that you must use people's pronouns. And he said, no way am I going to say something that I believe is false. The law cannot require me to say something I believe is false. And Solzhenitsyn, you know Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who writes about the Gulag in the Soviet Union, when the Soviets threw people in prison all the time for having the wrong political views. And he said, one of the first things that the Soviet regime required of you was to lie. You had to lie that they had a great harvest when they hadn't had a great harvest. You had to lie that Stalin was wonderful when he wasn't wonderful. The worst part about totalitarianism is being required to lie. Isn't that interesting? There's a lot of bad things about totalitarianism. But he said the worst part was being asked to lie. And that if you don't lie, you are thrown into the gulag. And he said, if you are forced to say something you think is wrong, is false, it tears down your inner integrity. They do it on purpose because they know it weakens you. It weakens your moral sense. It weakens your inner self to consciously. Remember, we used the word. What was it? The cognitive dissonance. It's cognitive dissonance because you're required to say this, but innerly, on the inside, you're saying, no, I don't believe that. So that cognitive dissonance sort of tears you apart. And I think people have to realize that with the pronoun thing, is that when you require someone to say something that they believe is false, that is doing a tremendous wrong to them. We know everyone wants us to be compassionate toward the person who's dealing with gender dysphoria, but they don't think about being compassionate to the person who's being asked to say a falsehood, because that's dangerous and damaging to them. So that's the case we have to make.
Don't you think it's different whether you interact with one person or whether you represent something in the system you're living in? Sometimes as you're talking to a person, it needs time. And the first step we can do is just accept and call them as they want to be called, but still hold our line and not represent false things in culture.
What we do, so her question was, it does take time, and isn't it maybe sometimes a good idea to use their pronouns, as a preliminary sort of strategy to show an acceptance? Talk to we need to all be talking to detransitioners. There are more and more detransitioners today, and we should be getting their experience. They are saying, many of them are saying, no, I wish people had not gone along with it. I wish people had held me accountable. I wish people had not said, oh yeah, whatever you need, whatever you want, whatever you feel. I think we should be really listening to them. And there are, I don't know if here in the States, there are now lawsuits starting because there was one that was just accepted. But Chloe Cole, there's a young woman named Chloe Cole, and she's been one of the most open, most public detransitioners, and she's taking Kaiser Permanente, the big medical group, to court. And what they're saying is, I had psychological issues, and instead of dealing with those, I was fast-tracked into transitioning. And they will say things like, I wish people had put, guardrails up. I wish they'd put obstacles up. I wish they'd put speed bumps, however you want to put it. And that it wasn't loving to go along with it. And I tend to think that that's true.
Thank you. Nancy, imagine a school. It really happened 10 minutes from here. A girl in the 3rd grade, 10 years, decided she wants no longer to be identified as a girl. The parents supported her. What should I do as a teacher? And what should I do as a father of a friend of this girl?
you should take your kids out of school.
Okay.
More and more parents are saying that because, I'm pretty active on Twitter. I have to be for my job, right? I have to promote my books, and so it's not like I like being on Twitter, but I have to be. But, so I see these examples all the time, right? You guys know Libs of TikTok? That's a woman who's become quite famous because she posts a lot of these examples. She finds examples, outrageous examples in the public schools of teachers who are teaching their kids to be transgender and so on. And that, like the example I gave this earlier today, that first graders being told, you may feel you're a boy even if you have what some people call girl parts. And there's actually a lawsuit on that too. A girl came home, a little girl, first grade, came home and she said, "Mommy, my teacher told me just because you have girl parts doesn't mean you're a girl. Just because you have boy parts doesn't mean you're a boy. So, Mommy, what am I?" And the little girl literally said, "Please take me to a doctor so we can find out what I am." And the only reason I know about it is because it's in the news, because the parents were suing the school for emotional distress. So, whoops. But I have to say that some of the schools are so far gone that when you see the comments on Twitter, there's so many people just saying, you've got to get your kid out of there. If the drag queens, are in the schools, and the propaganda is so intense. Like I said, most kids are now getting into the transgender mindset through schools. It used to be the internet, right? It used to be that they were going on the internet and finding the idea that, hey, I can be the opposite sex. Now it's primarily schools. Kids are coming home from school and saying that's where they first got the idea that being trans was even a possibility and that it might be fun to do. So I'm actually kind of serious that Christians need to start departing the public schools because, at least in the States, I think it's probably worse in the States right now, but the transgender, the gay and transgender themes are pushed so heavily. The classrooms are just full of transgender flags and gay flags, and like I said, teachers who openly make little videos and say, here's how I tell my kids my identity. Like, really? An adult has to tell a 5-year-old what my sex life is? Yes, they must get affirmation from their 5-year-olds. It is getting to the point, at least in the States, where many of our public schools are probably beyond repair, at least in your kid's lifetime. Now, there are parents who are fighting back, of course, and it was very famous in Virginia, Loudoun County. Parents got on the school board and were able to reverse a transgender policy. And there was an election for governor, and the governor who supported the parents won the election, and so everyone was like, "Oh, the tide is turning. You now win. You now win on the opposite side of the. If you take a stand against the transgender activism, you can now win politically, whereas for a long time you couldn't." So there are people who make it, and San Francisco. I mean, if you can do it there, you can do it anywhere. There are a group of conservative and Christian parents who took over the school board in San Francisco and started voting out the bad policies and voting in good policies. So it's not like you can't do anything, but for your own child, if they're in the school right now, you need an answer right now. And so that's my first reaction. Is your first job is your kids. It's just protect your own kids. But the longer term solution is run for school board. Work on the local issues. Christians have so long have just ignored things like school boards and not realized that the school has changed dramatically since we were, when I started homeschooling, my mom's a teacher. She's like, what are you doing? And Mom, you have no idea how the schools have changed since you were a teacher. It's much, much more secular. It's much harder to be a Christian in the public schools today than it was, just a generation ago. So I guess I've talked long enough on that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Very good. So someone is asking that a family member started to change the gender already with a surgery. And how can we help this person to encourage her, or how we, the person who asked, how can she encounter this family member?
Yeah, I just keep coming back to presenting the Christian view in a positive way, because I think, again, almost everyone I've ever talked to about these things will say, well, how can I tell them it's wrong? Whether the family member is either homosexual or transgender, how can I tell them it's against the Bible and they shouldn't do it? Well, I think you start with, let me tell you what the Christian view is of the body. And, it's God's creation, and it has great value. And when we talk about the Christian ethic, it's not primarily a negative message. It's primarily a positive message. That we want you to care about your body. We want you to care about, how God made you, and that it's good. It's good to be female. It's good to be male. And I think that's the hardest part. Young girls don't think it's good to be a female anymore. For whatever reason. I mean, the overly strict stereotypes, pornography. Pornography scares a lot of girls because they think boys want them to do things that are distasteful and scary. And so pornography has made it harder to be a girl. And just the sheer, the media where everyone has to be perfect. And girls use those filters. I don't know how those filters work, but they use those filters so that they look like models, even if they're not, because they think they have to look that way. I think the fact that the majority of rapid onset gender dysphoria is mostly girls, right? I mean, tomorrow I'll show you a graph. The number of girls who are transgender goes like this, and then it goes boom. It's a steep cliff. And so I think we need to be asking, why don't our girls want to be girls anymore? What is it about being a girl in modern culture that scares them, that makes them feel like they don't want to be a girl? Sexual abuse definitely plays a role because, I've talked to detransitioners. I've listened to detransitioners, and I've read their stuff. And so many times they will say something like, after the sexual abuse, I thought, if I'm a boy, I won't be abused. I won't be abused anymore if I'm a boy. And then there's even family issues. Ken Zucker, who is known as the top researcher on transgenderism, and who talks about some of the families who he helped. Even family things like the family had a boy, and then they had a girl, and the girl had health issues, and so they had to spend a lot of time with her. Well, the boy felt rejected, because my family is paying all this attention to the girl. So he decided he was going to be a girl. So when the psychologist got down to the root of it, it was a psychological issue where he felt like somehow if he was a girl, he would get the attention that his younger sister was getting. So it's very important to look at each individual case and see what is driving it for this individual person. But then, and then again, the basic principle being your body is good. Don't deface it with surgery. Don't ruin its functions, with surgery. And be aware that you're probably not going to be able to have children. Chloe Cole, who I just mentioned, who's been the most public detransitioner, says, "I'm never going to breastfeed my babies. In fact, I don't know if I can have babies." And she had a double mastectomy at age 15. She said, I wasn't old enough to know what I was doing. And I wasn't old enough to know the implications of this. And many of them, are they call it pediatric transitioners. They were so young, they didn't really know what they were doing. And in hindsight, like I said earlier with your question, in hindsight, so many of them are saying, I wish I'd gotten counseling. I wish I'd gotten people who would answer these other psychological questions first, instead of saying, oh yeah, sure, you're a girl now, boom. Yeah, so they didn't want to do it because they called it gatekeeping. Well, gatekeeping is good. Psychological counseling is good. And you probably know there are people who got on hormones or puberty blockers after a 30-minute consult. They're not getting adequate counseling. Oh, and one other thing. And many of them do have deep psychological issues. The first study ever done of rapid onset gender dysphoria was done by Lisa Littman at Brown University. And she found that 63% of the girls who came out as transgender had previously diagnosed mental health issues. In other words, prior to their gender dysphoria, they already had, well, depression and anxiety, two of the most common ones, cutting, self-harming, and bipolar disorder, et cetera, et cetera. 63% had, now, most teenagers have some anxiety and depression, but these were kids who were severe enough that they had already gone to a counselor and gotten a diagnosis. And those 63% of them obviously should have been getting counseling first. They should not be immediately transitioned. So that study kind of underscores the fact that these are very troubled kids, and they need a lot of love and support.
That connects us to another question. People who have a gender dysphoria, what is the Christian way to have a good life with that issue? What is the Christian answer and better way to live?
You mean if they have gender dysphoria and they don't overcome it? Yes. They just live it? Yeah, because you do realize, if you've read on this subject at all, you probably know that 80 to 90% of kids outgrow their gender dysphoria. And usually during puberty, because of the rush of hormones. They start feeling comfortable with their biological sex. And so, which is good news. Most of them, if you do nothing, they will end up being fine. That's another reason transitioning them so early is not a good idea, because many of them would have been fine if you had just left them alone. They don't think it at the time, right? They think teenagers think, this is a terrible crisis, I must fix it. But if the parents can get them over the hump, most of them, no, Brandon did not. So I know that there are some people who do not. So Brandon didn't really come to grips with it until his mid-20s. So the way you live with it is this. Most people with gender dysphoria are something like Brandon, people who are kind of outliers in their personality, right? So that boys who are more sensitive and emotional and artistic, girls who are more take charge, assertive, aggressive. Generally, there's people who don't fit the stereotypes. That's what first made them think maybe they weren't really a girl or really a boy. It's because they didn't fit the stereotypes. So the answer is, get rid of these stereotypes. The answer is help young people overcome the sense that there's something wrong with me if I don't fit the stereotypes. Brandon told me the strongest stereotypes are in Christian circles. And I think it's because Christian circles are almost overcompensating, right, against the sort of androgyny that we have in our culture today, and non-binary identities. There are schools today where half the kids are non-binary. Because non-binary is the safe thing to be, right? You're not male, you're not female. You don't have to defend being one or the other. You're non-binary. So it's become very popular. But what it does say is that they don't feel comfortable with a lot of the stereotypes that we have today. And I would say, fine, get rid of the stereotypes. don't feel like you have to fit into a stereotype. It is hard. I mean, Brandon finds it difficult with the sort of John Wayne masculinity image that is in a lot of Christian circles. It's not easy. So I'm not pretending it's easy. And I have also talked to girls. They will come after me, talk to me after a talk like this, and I'll find out that there are these very assertive, take charge, leadership type girls, and they don't feel like they're accepted in the Christian world either. They're not the soft, fluffy, flowery. And there was one, I'll give you just one example. There was one, I spoke at a Christian college that was a very, very rural, small place in Tennessee, very conservative. And I finally had to say to her, you need to leave Tennessee. Go to New York City. You fit better there. Because she did. Who she was wonderful. But she was very assertive, very strong-willed, very intellectual, and, typical New Yorker. Anyway, the point is, yes, I think that people who have ongoing gender dysphoria is usually because they are outliers on the personality spectrum. The spectrum from very assertive to very gentle, the men and women on both ends. If you're at one of those ends, it doesn't mean you're really the opposite sex. There are men on the gentle side, which is Brandon's way, way, way over. And there are women on the assertive, take charge, rational side of it as well. Take them through and show them these are okay places for you to be. Look, the spectrum has a spot for you. You belong on the spectrum too. You're not some sort of weird, person off the normal charts. There's a place for you on this chart. So the Myers-Briggs personality test, I use it with my students, by the way. So I'm very much into it. And I find that for people who are atypical in their personality, they can find it very comforting. Oh, I'm this. Oh, I'm this. Oh, and that's okay. Yeah, I've had some students just come alive when they realize that they didn't fit any of the normal stereotypes, but there's a spot for them, and here's their good qualities. Because the Myers-Briggs books tell them, here's all the good qualities for your type. And they're like, wow, I can be me? Wow, I didn't think I could be me. And so, yeah, I do that as well with my students a lot.
Ich denke, das ist so wichtig. Wir sind im Moment mit Bless-Tour, mit unserer Jugendbewegung, in einer Serie über Männer nach dem Herzen Gottes und Frauen nach dem Herzen Gottes. 2 weeks ago, this auditorium was full with 700 young people, and I was speaking about godly men. And I think that's what we have to do also in our churches. We have to take out our Bibles and not speak about stereotypes, but deconstruct them with the Bible and tell especially the young people what God has in his mind with men and women.
And it is true that most of the moral commands in Scripture are not sex specific. Most of the commands in Scripture are to everybody, right? There's only a few, like within the context of marriage, for example, there's only a few that are specifically to men and women. And so I don't know why Christians sort of overcompensate on this issue, because the Bible itself, the vast majority of commands are to men and women.
Herzlichen Dank. Wir könnten noch lange zuhören. Ich glaube aber, dass wir gerade mit dieser positiven Botschaft enden wollen. Und lass uns kurz noch diesen Gedanken mitnehmen. Wir haben eine positive Botschaft, auch für den Körper. Der Körper wird nicht degradiert, sondern er gehört zu dieser wunderbaren Schöpfungsordnung Gottes. Und dreht euch noch kurz mal um, sagt euch noch mal kurz, ein Statement, was ihr mitnehmt von dem Ganzen, nachdem wir Nancy einen riesengroßen Applaus gegeben haben für diesen wunderbaren Abend.